Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We have over 100 people registered for today's webinar, which is super exciting. And definitely some people still trickling in slowly here. So my name is Gabby Nichols, and I'm the Programs Coordinator at the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. And thanks for joining us for our NISAW, our National Invasive Species Awareness Week webinar today. And today's topic, as you know, is on invasive Phragmites Best Management Practices, presented by Vicki Simkovic of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So hi, Vicki, you can wave. There you go. Yeah, so this is a part of our National Invasive Species Awareness Week winter webinar series. So I had the pleasure to work with Vicki at OIPC in the past few years. So it's nice to be talking together again, hosting these webinars again. So it's kind of like old times, but we'll turn off our videos for now. We just wanted to say hi with the videos on, and I'll continue to introduce. And I also wanted to note that we have Brittany Finnegan of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council in the background as well, helping out kindly today with the technical side of things, just to make sure everything's running smoothly. So thank you, Brittany, for that. Brittany is the Communication and Business Development team member at the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. So thanks, Brittany. So I'd like to formally begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving the relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations people that call this land home. So I'm pleased to give a warm welcome and introduction to Vicki Simkovic, who is the coordinator at the Ontario Invasive Plant Council. At the OIPC, Vicki organizes various activities, including interacting with OIPC members and the public, presenting and hosting meetings, workshops, and conferences, assisting in the creation, updating, and distribution of educational resources, and fostering partnerships. Vicki's presentation today is on the Phragmites Best Management Practices. The management of invasive species like Phragmites is constantly evolving. In 2020, OIPC completed a new best management practice document for Phragmites as an update to the 2011 Phragmites BMP. So that incorporates the latest research and experience from practitioners in the field. This webinar will review Phragmites management, including how Phragmites impacts species at risk, considerations for minimizing unintended ecological impacts, and control techniques such as selective cutting or spading on land and water. So at this point, I will pass the mic over to you, Vicki, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabby, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I see we got a number of people from the US as well, and all around Canada, so I'm glad you could join us. Today I'll be going through, as Gabby mentioned, and highlighting some of the key updates in OIPC's new Phragmites Best Management Practice document. And just a brief intro about the OIPC. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council is a nonprofit organization with a mandate to provide a coordinated provincial response to the growing threat of invasive plants. Through research, networking, and knowledge sharing, we support on-the-ground initiatives to prevent, detect, and manage invasive plants throughout Ontario. Our board of directors is diverse, including representatives from all levels of government, non-government, academia, municipalities, and conservation industries and industry, and with the goal of providing leadership, expertise, and a forum to engage and empower Ontarians to take action against invasive plants. And you can visit our website to learn more and follow us on social media to stay up to date. Throughout the years, OIPC has developed an extensive library of best management practice documents for key invasive plant species, and we now have about 23 BMPs available on our website for free download. And in 2020, we received generous support from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks Ontario to develop a new BMP for invasive Phragmites. The original was written in 2011, and since then, Phragmites management has evolved a fair bit, and much of the information was outdated or incomplete. So this new BMP provides many updates and emphasizes specifically how native species and species at risk can be impacted by Phragmites and how Phragmites management can potentially impact species at risk and their habitat. So Phragmites can impact a variety of flora and fauna in different ways. This BMP begins with a background summary on what species at risk are impacted by Phragmites and how they are impacted. This is organized into tables for the different taxa, which include birds, amphibians, reptiles, plants, insects, and fish. The information used in these tables was based on a 2015 study contracted by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. This study found that 25% of Ontario's species at risk were considered threatened by Phragmites, and this was according to species recovery documents that including information found in federal and provincial recovery strategies, COSEWIC status reports, and government response statements. So numerous threats were identified in the study and included for birds, reducing the amount of open water in wetland areas, for amphibians, having Phragmites invading into the species preferred habitat, for reptiles, reducing movement, increasing isolation, making it harder to find mates, for plants, outcompeting beneficial areas and losing germination sites, as well as habitat loss for insect species. The study then ranked these different threats according to whether it was a high or moderate impact to low impact, as well as potential and unknown impacts. An updated summary table for reviewing the morphological and in-field characteristics of native versus invasive frag was also added. This included clarification on which features of Phragmites are considered most definitive in order to be able to ID it in the field. These include ligule width, which is generally considered the most reliable. Leaf retention and standing dead stem density can be looked at any time of year, and stem color is a pretty good characteristic as well, especially during the growing season, with the native Phragmites having more of a brown stem and invasive more of a beigey brown color. And the native is more of a reddish, so reddish brown, and invasive is more of the dull brown color. So the value of stand and morphological traits are generally improved when you consider multiple measurements at the same time, and that many of these traits can be useful, but they're not definitively diagnostic. And so again, it's better to consult, to look at multiple measurements in combination and to consult expertise if unsure. So this BMP also includes a section on considerations for minimizing ecological impacts during Phragmites management. While the presence of Phragmites can harm native species and species at risk, removal may also impact these activities. For example, some species, such as the least bittern, will use Phragmites stands for habitat or refuge when there's no other quality habitat available. Therefore, it's important to consider how species at risk are using this habitat and how also native flora and fauna might be disturbed when Phragmites management activities are undertaken, and then to take mitigative action and planning measures. So some mitigative actions and planning measures include conducting habitat assessments at the site before conducting any kind of management, considering special timing windows for different taxa, and then taking mitigative actions at the different stages of management, the management cycle. In terms of habitat assessment, before any management begins, it's important to conduct an assessment in the area to detect what species at risk or other sensitive species might be present and their probable habitat. This is typically completed by qualified biologists who are knowledgeable about species at risk in Ontario. It's important when you're doing these surveys to consider all taxa that might be present and to note that the detection of these individual species can vary depending on the time of year, habitat, weather conditions, and survey methods. So there's quite a bit of variability in detection success. So it's important to know that just because a species isn't found doesn't mean it's not present, even in disturbed sites such as ditches and water management areas. It can also be helpful to do these assessments to help assess performance targets for management. So for example, to show whether a specific species has increased after doing some Phragmites removal. And again, that habitat assessment should be completed by qualified biologists knowledgeable about SAR in Ontario. So it's also important to consider species at risk timing windows. The presence of different species may impact how and when we control Phragmites. And so it's important to consider these timing windows when performing management. Avoid management in general when species are breeding, nesting, or spawning, and take caution during the active or growth phase. This timing will vary widely depending on the region's species, weather and site conditions, and also type of Phragmites activity you're conducting. It's advised to consult relevant legislation and expertise and get any permits prior to starting any work, especially if you're working in sensitive habitat. The BMP also includes a table that summarizes what potential impacts could occur to species at risk due to project activities at different stages of Phragmites management and what mitigative actions to consider. So for example, pre and post control, so before and after you conduct Phragmites control, it's important to survey the site. But when surveyors are on the site, they may potentially cause harm or stress to species that are present in the area or cause disturbance and damage their habitats. So it's important to have individuals who are familiar with species at risk habitats and to do various measures that will minimize disturbance, completing surveys on foot, avoiding stepping on rocks or vegetation mats, avoiding disturbing brush piles, and any kind of sticks or fallen logs that are moved should be returned back to the position they're found in. And if there was any needed handling, capturing of species like reptiles, that should be minimized as much as possible. Another stage is there's any use of heavy machinery to adopt a clean equipment protocol and get in the habit of inspecting and cleaning equipment before and after management is complete and prior to moving between sites to prevent the movement of any seed spread or disease between wetlands. And then in terms of mitigative actions to prevent impacts during control activities, herbicide application can pose a risk if there's non-target vegetation that's also sprayed. And heavy equipment that's used for herbicide application can also be cause a lot of disturbance. And so it's important to reduce non-target action by following all the up-to-date pesticide labels, instructions, and doing things like backpack spraying of like glyphosate might be better than using large equipment to reduce disturbance, especially in more sensitive areas. Another method is control. So especially burning when wildlife is active, it may result in mortality and injury or loss of nest sites. So burning is typically done to reduce standing dead biomass of Phragmites. And this method is of course, it's not applicable in many sites. So it's important to check with the local municipality and make sure that burning permits can be obtained and are relevant to the site. So burning should never take place when the species in the area are active. So that's why this technique is generally done in the winter when burning removes the old above ground stands and reduces wildlife interactions. In terms of, there's mulching, cutting, and rolling. So heavy machinery may also cause damage to marsh habitats and species and soil compaction. So some actions include identifying whether there are species at risk on the site, choosing the appropriate timing windows and lighter machinery, avoiding repetitive movement of machinery where Phragmites has been previously pushed down, and continuing to do surveys throughout the site. Okay, so since Phragmites management has evolved over the last 10 years, this BMP divides management techniques into methods that are known to be effective, so established management techniques, and methods that are still used but considered less effective, so low efficacy management techniques, and also includes information about future management techniques and goals. All of these management techniques and their effectiveness will depend on site conditions, management goals, as well as resources that are available. The techniques are often become ineffective if they're used alone. So typically techniques are best when they're combined with other techniques. So we have here in terms of ancillary management techniques that are often used in conjunction with things like herbicide application or selective cutting. So things like cultural control, mulching, and prescribed burning. And generally also it's best when it's combined. It's applied for multiple years, so you have the same, you're doing treatment at the same site for multiple years, and you continue to do follow-up monitoring. So generally techniques become less successful when monitoring isn't done afterwards to make sure that the treatment did work and was successful. So over dry land, the options available include herbicide application and selective cutting or spading on land. So herbicide application includes the use of products with active ingredients glyphosate and Invasive. These two products are registered for control, or two ingredients are registered for control of Phragmites in Canada. In Ontario, these products can only be applied over dry land where surface water is not present. Herbicide treatment is most effective when combined with follow-up treatment techniques such as prescribed burning or cutting to reduce dead standing biomass and to help regenerate native vegetation. If herbicide application occurs in sensitive habitats where species at risk may be present, the timing should be restricted to late summer or early fall. This timing generally coincides with the reduced activity of native wildlife as well as dormancy native vegetation. So this would reduce the likelihood of native species being impacted by Phragmites. It's also an ideal time as Phragmites plants later in the season are actively transferring nutrients to the rhizomes in the late summer, early fall, which allow the herbicide to be translocated and impact the root system. Another technique is selective cutting or spading on land, or it's just called spading often. It involves manually cutting the Phragmites stalks to reduce photosynthesis and deprive the below ground structures of energy. So these photos that are included in the BMP illustrate the different steps required to remove Phragmites using a spade. It's typically best done in sandy substrate along sandy shorelines where a spade can be used to more easily cut below the soil surface. And so generally a sharpened spade or cutting tool is used and the Phragmites stalk is cut below the soil surface as low as possible where the stalk attaches to the underground rhizome. This technique may need to be repeated several times during the growing season as new shoots arise and follow-up control is often needed. One great advantage of this technique is it provides an accessible technique for the public to get involved and for like property owners and cottage groups who want to be engaged in invasive species control. This is a fairly easy method that they could do and it's quite effective, especially in sandy habitats. And it's also best in these kind of habitats where often herbicide application can pose risks to just sensitive species. This technique is a nice, it's a low, there's a low chance of damaging the ecosystem with this technique. For wet sites, options include flooding and selective cutting or spading in water. So in terms of flooding, Flooding is used in areas where you can predict the water levels. So areas where there are frequent floods like shoreline properties or dam infrastructure like stormwater management pods where water levels can be controlled or manipulated. So flooding is most effective if it occurs during the growth phase in spring and summer to prevent it from growing, and is most effective if the water depths can be maintained at a specified level and then remain flooded throughout the growing season. So the idea behind behind flooding is to starve the rhizomes of oxygen by depriving them of any ability to obtain the oxygen from the air. So water depth should reach a minimum of 30 centimeters, so about knee depth, to reduce the plant's ability to obtain oxygen. Deep water levels make flooding more effective at starving frag of oxygen. The technique is less effective if there's a large rhizome system because stands along shorelines are easily able to supply the flooded stems with oxygen. There's also selective cutting or spading in water. So this is a very similar concept to flooding. So the idea is to cut below the water line and inhibit the supply of oxygen to the rhizomes and essentially drown the plant. So this method can be applied at several scales, from small to large scales. On a small scale, handheld tools can be used, like what's shown here, a raspberry cane cutter, or you can use a spade or brush cutters to cut the Phragmites stem. And in the large scale, amphibious cutting vehicles can also be used. So the goal, the aim with this is to cut as close to the substrate as possible, or even beneath the substrate, again to a water depth of at least 30 centimeters in knee height. For handheld tools, this can be performed up to a depth of about 1.2 meters, so at the average where a person can really, with their hands, reach under and cut. Otherwise, it's not very practical. So sometimes it's not the most practical techniques for highly dense or well-established stands. Another negative is can be very laborious and time-consuming, but an advantage is that it allows for the control of frag in areas where pesticides would be prohibited. And then things like canoes or barges or watercraft can be used to collect and transport stems and move them inland for disposal. And then there's the amphibious cutting vehicles, which are an interesting machine that are especially designed to cut and collect Phragmites and used for large and well-established stands. Sometimes additional equipment is added to the machine to collect and dispose of cut biomass, including containment booms, barges, backhoes, and dump trucks. Some management logistics to consider is whether the site is accessible to this large vehicle and to have trained and experienced crew operating the vehicle. Some other things to keep in mind with the amphibious machine is fish spawning and nesting birds and turtles that might be impacted with using this machine. So noting that working in water can be disruptive or damaging to fish habitats. There are also some ancillary management techniques I'll cover, which are techniques that would be applied in conjunction with one of the previous methods I've mentioned. So cultural control is a relatively newer area of research, looking into potentially if there are any native aggressive or competitive native plants that can help outcompete Phragmites. So this is usually used at a site that once a control has happened, then the site becomes revegetated by seeding or planting with competitive native grasses, forbs, and woody plants, with the goal of resisting future invasion and to protect soil from furthering invasion and helping restoration efforts. So several groups and universities have studied different species that could be potential options. So I've just listed a couple here in grouping the native woody shrubs, flowering forb species, and grasses and sedges that have all been considered for use in cultural control for Phragmites. Okay, and then there's mulching. So mulching is combined with other management techniques like herbicide application, and involves manual cutting of above ground biomass into smaller parts. This can help increase the efficacy of herbicide application and help the herbicide intercept the plants. Mulching is used in open areas that can support mulching equipment, which can be quite heavy and bulky. It's ideal for removing dense above ground biomass before herbicide treatment and where prescribed burning is not possible. So note also that mulching Phragmites shortly before or too soon after herbicide application significantly reduces herbicide effectiveness. And then there's prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is used for removing biomass before or after other management techniques. So herbicide, by removing dead standing biomass, the effectiveness of herbicide application is increased due to the greater ability for herbicide to intercept the living plants. So typically burns mentioned earlier are only done in the later season, late fall, end of winter, before wildlife like birds, reptiles, and amphibians become active. And then there's some low efficacy management techniques that are still used, although they're not considered as effective for a number of reasons. One is excavating. So that's basically coming in with a large excavator, mechanical equipment, digging out the soil and removing the stem and root system. The negative of this, it's very time consuming, expensive, and all the plant material needs to be removed to be successful. It's not appropriate for sensitive habitats or risk species. It introduces a lot of soil disturbance and it can promote Phragmites growth. Grazing involves the use of animals like cattle or goats to reduce the above ground growth and spread of Phragmites. This method is considered impractical for a lot of management sites, especially for sensitive habitat and where there's sensitive plant species that could be trampled by these grazing animals. And as with any method, it only removes the above ground structure, so grazing doesn't impact the root system and would need to be combined with other management techniques to be effective. Grazing at the wrong time of year can also increase Phragmites growth and stem density, as well as the expense that's involved in purchasing animals. Tarping has been used a few times in Ontario for Phragmites. It involves using a thick, dark material to smother the plant and eliminate light penetration. It can be effective, but it's laborious and expensive, and especially if you have a large area that you want to cover. So the tarp needs to be large enough to cover the cell, the Phragmites cell that you want to control, but also then beyond that boundary so that you can get any stragglers on the outside of the Phragmites tarp. And it needs to be in place. It will have a way to be secured and stay in place for quite a long period of time, like up to at least a season or even up to a year. And it needs to be continually monitored for regrowth of stems around the fringe of the tarp and to make sure that the tarp is continuing to stay on the ground. Cutting seed heads is often done as well. It's a laborious and time-consuming method and doesn't kill the rhizome. But if it is the only option to control the spread of Phragmites, it can help to curb some of the spread, and it's best done before the seeds are viable in late summer. For the last 10 years, there's also been a lot of research and updates on biological control methods. There has been over 20 years now of research, including field exploration and host range testing in Europe to find the suitable host. And two have been identified. Two stem-boring nectuid moths have been identified as appropriate biological control agents for invasive frag in North America. The releases of these moths are Arcanera nerca and Lanisa geminipuncta in Canada were approved in 2019 by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. As of 2019 to 2020, researchers with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and the University of Toronto are designing and implementing a pilot-scale biological program for invasive frag in Southern Ontario. The release approvals are still pending in the United States, where research is being conducted as well out of Cornell University and the University of Rhode Island. And then in terms of herbicide application over water, at the time of our document publication, there's no herbicide permitted for use on Phragmites in or around water in Ontario. Currently, an imazapyr-based product can be applied over water is being assessed for registration under the Federal Pest Control Products Act by Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency. There was a project done, a glyphosate-based herbicide treatment over water that occurred in Ontario for a special emergency use pilot project in 2 locations at Long Point and Rondo coastal marshes on Lake Erie, which was aimed at supporting local wetlands and species at risk habitat restoration. And I would encourage you to read more in our BMP about this great project. In terms of disposal, we have disposal techniques for Phragmites divided into 2 categories. It's ones that are used quite commonly, and then the less common disposal techniques that need, some of them need further research. So bagging is the easiest kind, which is putting seed heads at any rhizomes or any plant material in thick garbage bags, tying them and leaving them out in the sun to decay, and then disposing in regular landfill. And then there's burning. So where local bylaws permit, burning can effectively remove cut biomass for the site. Drying as well. So drying involves taking Phragmites biomass and leaving the cut stalks on the site under a dark colored tarp and leaving in the sun for 1 to 3 weeks until the plant material is not viable, and then sending that material to a landfill or composting facility, or it can be burned if that's appropriate. Sometimes Phragmites can be also left on the site, so where plant parts won't spread or disturb sensitive habitats. So generally before seed heads are developed, the biomass of just the plant stem and leaves can remain on a site, and they can shade and cover soil and reduce the growth of native plant species in the area. And then in terms of less common disposal techniques, there's bioenergy production. So the use of Phragmites biomass for bioenergy is still being explored. It hasn't been applied in any way in management yet. Burying as well. So the idea of burying the Phragmites in soil to a minimum depth of 1 meter of overburden and placing in the Phragmites biomass with the idea that the plant can't access sunlight and can't survive. So this has been used as an option in really large sites with a lot of Phragmites biomass, and more research is needed to determine the viability of this technique. Composting as well. Composting is still under research to determine the specific required temperature and duration needed to make the plant parts unviable. So that's not an area that's well known yet. And lastly, I wanted to thank our reviewers and all of our contributors who greatly contributed to the success of the final version, as well as our subcommittee, the Ontario Phragmites Working Group. I would like to say there's a couple educational webinars, especially related to invasive Phragmites and this new BMP. So stay tuned on our website, check our website out for upcoming educational webinars. And that's my presentation. So thank you very much, and looking forward to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Vicki. That was excellent and a really thorough overview of the BMP. I just saw there's some questions that had come in during your presentation, and Brittany has answered one of them. Do we have access to these slides somewhere afterwards? That would be a great resource. So this webinar is recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And Brittany has also noted that the Phragmites BMP, which this presentation is based on, is located on the Ontario invasive plants.ca site. So you can find it there for free. All right, Sophie has a question. Is the Bickerton 2015 study available online? I've not been successful in finding it on the ontario.ca website.
So I know, yeah, it was, I was able to access it online when I did this Google Scholar search. But if you're having trouble, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy what we have on hand. So my email is Vicki@oninvasives.ca or info@oninvasives.ca, and I can get you a copy.
Great. Okay, Marty's question is, there are glyphosate formulations available in the US that are approved for use over water. Can you get the Ontario government to provide long-term permits to use these products? They seem like a much less invasive control method than some of the mechanical treatments when applied properly.
Yeah, so far the only approved use of glyphosate over water has been with the emergency use registration pilot project in Rondeau and Long Point. So otherwise, I don't know of any others. It's quite it's not easy always to get the permits. So that's yeah, it's tricky. It's not always easy. It's usually for very limited large scale projects that would be considered, but otherwise no, they're not available.
And I think you mentioned in your presentation as well that at this time, I believe public consultation just ended for I think it was an imazapyr product over water, but so some things in the work, but
yeah,
these things definitely take time. There's a long process of review. So,
and the imazapyr over water has been, yeah, like that imazapyr over water has been they've been looking at it for many years already. So it is a very slow process.
and would definitely be another tool in the toolbox, which would be appreciated for this crazy invasive species. So great. Another question, could you please explain the leaving on-site disposal technique? Are there other recommended disposal techniques more effective than simply leaving the plant parts on the site? Would this action not encourage further Phragmites growth?
Yeah, typically this one is used if there are no reproductive parts at all. So it's essentially just the leaves and stems. I don't know too many groups that use this technique. I don't know if Gabby, you have further insights on that disposal, but generally it's removing the plant parts from the site is really the best option and most commonly used. So things like tarping and bagging is much more common.
Yes, just referring to what Janice Gilbert of the Invasive Phragmites Control Center has mentioned to me about the leaving the Phragmites on site. Like, you're right, you mentioned the not having the reproductive parts, but I think she always emphasized also leaving it high and dry on the site, so away from any water where it might spread further, kind of get into that. But yeah, this is usually, I think, for larger amounts of biomass without the reproductive parts, but high and dry, away from any sort of like wind or water where they could spread further. And then we have another question, or not sure exactly what this is referring to, but best practice for shallow water infestation. So I'm not sure if it's a...
Yeah, so I think that's where you have the water is less than 30 centimeters, so that kind of cutting underwater isn't effective in that deep, in that deeper water. Yeah, that's that's the hardest, absolute hardest one, especially in Ontario, where there just isn't a lot of chemical option or a lot of options for that. So that becomes the hardest to treat. You can't do herbicide application. The cutting spading method doesn't work. I think I've heard of people cutting the seed heads and just kind of reducing spread that way. But sometimes places like that are sort of just left and not controlled, and kind of moved on to other areas where techniques can be used and applied.
Definitely. Yeah, and one note on the cutting underwater, I think it was recently sort of observed that 30 centimeter minimum is great to achieve, but it also depends on the water turbidity, so the clarity of the water. So I think the more clear the water, the easier it is for sunlight to reach the bottom and kind of promote the growth. So turbidity would definitely play a part in that too, not just depth, but definitely, yeah. Due to the extremely high water conditions on Georgian Bay, we have witnessed vast areas of Phragmites colonies being completely removed from the beach, along with everything else, by the force of storms, surges, etc. Many local politicians have referred to this situation as indicating that the frag problem is now resolved. How would you respond to this? My gut tells me that this is just waiting to return once the water recedes.
I wonder if the Phragmites colonies really have been completely removed, or what they mean by that. I would say that Phragmites is kind of it's, anything in nature is over, it takes years to see any impact. So I would say that, just because you might not see as much of it year, it's very much could still be there and in future years come back with a vengeance. So I would say the site would still need to be monitored for the presence of Phragmites, and that the Phragmite cell really has been killed. And yeah, as you say, it's just waiting to return once the water recedes. So that could definitely be what happens. So it's best not to reach any conclusions until you know.
I think that's great advice. I think with Phragmites, yeah, if we know anything, it's you need to monitor again and again and go back. And I know from presentations at the Ontario Phragmites Working Group meeting that OIPC recently held, a lot of groups are seeing this across Ontario with higher water levels. Frag is being controlled by those higher levels, but yeah, it may only take a lower water level year to bring it back too. So definitely something to monitor. Do you have a source for the best below water cutters like weed trimmers in Canada?
I don't, but if you send me an email, I can get back to you on that one and look into it for you. You have to just shoot me an email, Vicki at oninvasives.ca.
Awesome. And I know from what I understand, a lot of the groups that are using the sort of below water cutters are modifying existing kind of brush cutter tools. I know Janice Gilbert has mentioned the steel brush cutters, but there are definitely some specifics with that, like lubricating it because of it's in the water, it's a different type of lubricant and that sort of thing. So yeah, I can definitely give Vicki some information so you can email her for more details. Do you have any information on dispersion of seeds in water?
Not really, just that it is another method of spread, along with rhizomes. From what I've read, it's a less common way that Phragmites spreads. It's typically when the rhizomes have been split and broken and move into new areas. I don't know if you've heard any, Gabby, if you might have any insights on that as well.
Not too much, just that it is a known pathway of spread, and very easily, similar to the Georgian Bay kind of question. Anytime there's sort of a storm, seeds or plant parts being transported in water can easily transport it to a new location. Yeah, I don't have too many more details on that though. Okay, and John says, yes, it is very persistent about the Georgian Bay question. So following on that question on shallow water techniques, how long does it take for the rhizome under the water to die once the stems have been cut? I'm not totally sure on the time for this. Actually, I do know that there's several Phragmites kind of experts or field people on the call. So if there is anyone who knows, you could put it in the chat box to all panelists and attendees. Feel free to chime in. Vicki, did you have anything on that?
Yeah, from what I've learned, it takes a bit of time. It's at least a season. Like it's probably why with flooding that the water needs to stay above that certain height for a long length of time, several months during the growing season, to kill it completely. And I think the more the better, the longer it can stay underwater. Agreed.
Yeah. Is there a benefit by just cutting down the plants frequently during the growing season?
There is. I mean, you can exhaust the rhizome system eventually if you do that, but you also run the risk of the plant growing more vigorously, and it's something once you start, you have to keep doing. So it's also looking at your time and resources that you would have to really be able to do that practically. And that is really the only method available for shallow water sites, which are it's a huge blind spot in management right now.
High labor technique for sure. Yeah. Are there any food or medicinal uses for the removal of Phragmites?
That's a great question. I don't know of any food or medicinal uses, but it has been used as a construction building material, and sometimes the hollowed stems, they make good habitat for cavity nesting bees. So sometimes they're great filler for bee nesting habitats.
And then one last question here. Do you know of any cross-border cooperation on Phragmites control between Canada and the USA?
Currently, no, it's the involvement with PAMP, the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework. There has been some partnership there, and I believe that I'm not as familiar with the emergency use pilot program. I think there has been some back and forth consultation between Canada and the US, but I'm not aware otherwise of too many projects that involve cross-border cooperation. Do you know of any, Gabby?
Just what you mentioned. So the Phragmites Adaptive Management Framework is run by the group, the Great Lakes Phragmites Collaborative. So that would, be the primary one that I know of for sure. And Vicki, I just thought maybe if you're able to provide maybe details on where to find this and any other kind of Phragmites work that OIPC is working on right now that people might be interested in. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Vicki, for sharing your expertise. I think it's a really important topic, Canada's worst invasive plants. So always something to keep up to date on. So thank you for joining and take care.